Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived, and it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today, it's a great pleasure for me to be sitting down to talk to Selina Spowart. And Selina has had 3 boys, and I've got 1 boy, so hats off to her for that. But not only did she have 3 boys, but 2 of them have autism. And one of them, her eldest boy, has very serious autism. And I think that you'll hear in this discussion that Selina has shown just incredible resilience and also humour in the face of what are extremely difficult circumstances. So, Selina, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Selina, just as background, would you mind giving us a little bit of where you grew up, what you studied, just a little bit of your childhood and your teenage years?
Sure. Yep. So I went to school with you, and I was born in Sydney
at Abbotsleigh.
At Abbotsleigh, yes, we were in high school together, and I'm one of 2 daughters in my family. And after school finished, I went off to university and studied arts and majored in literature. Got into the honours program, and then fell pregnant with our first child, Liam, who is our one with multiple complex disabilities that you referred to. So ended up deferring, and I'm only just now going back to postgrad study at age 54, but better late than never.
Mm-hmm. And so how old were you when Liam was born?
I was 26 when Liam was born, and because it took me quite a long while to get my degree because I was working at the time and worked my way through uni, so it did take a few years. So yes, 26, and he was diagnosed at age 3 months, so really very young. He was just a baby, and we were given the diagnosis because he was having seizures. We didn't know there were seizures. When it's your first child, you don't really know what you're looking at. So we took him along to the GP, and he basically admitted him to the Children's Hospital, and he was in there for a week of tests, and he was diagnosed with tuberous sclerosis, which is a rare disease. Affects about 1 in 8,000 people, but it can be extremely variable. People can go their whole lives and never know they have it until they come to have children themselves. It's very strongly correlated with autism and epilepsy. About 45% of people with TSC have autism, and epilepsy is very common too because tuberous sclerosis produces multiple hardened growths on the major organs. That's a feature of the condition. It's kind of an overactive cellular condition. It's due to an anomaly on chromosomes 9 and 16. And nowadays there is a prenatal screening test for it, but there wasn't back then. And there's no real treatment for tuberous sclerosis, or there are a lot of treatments for the symptoms of tuberous sclerosis, so epilepsy, for example, and sometimes lungs are involved, and kidneys, and obviously the brain. So that's where the epilepsy comes from. So brain surgery can often be a feature, but people with tuberous sclerosis, the good news is they do live normal lives for the most part. So they can often be pretty healthy people, like my son is, in spite of all his medical challenges.
Mm-hmm. And so you had a little 3-month-old baby. He was being admitted to hospital. How were you feeling at that stage?
Oh, I think you exist in a bit of a sense of disbelief at that time. And once we got the diagnosis, I remember just feeling like this can't possibly be happening to us. This stuff happens to other people. Someone's going to come in a minute and tell me it's all been a terrible mistake and we can go home. And even, once we were home, they said, at the time there was no internet, you must remember, so you can't go and Google a condition. So we went off to the hospital library and got a leaflet, and it was grim. It was very doom and gloomy, full of statistics about profound disability. But there were a couple of paragraphs about people who were basically, intellectually unaffected, might have some of the kidney lesions, might have a few of the skin signs, but largely intellectually just functioning, at the standard of most people. So we just decided to think, well, that's going to be what happens. You know, our son's not going to be one of the severely affected ones. Everything will be all right. He won't have autism. It's funny because I often joke, well, it's not really a joke, but you'll find out that I do make jokes out of everything. It's my way of coping, black humour and all. I used to say I was always, when I was pregnant, I was always saying to myself, please don't let my child have a disability. I couldn't cope. I just couldn't cope. And then when my child had a disability, the next thing was, please don't let him have autism. I just couldn't cope if he had autism. And, of course, he turned out to have autism. He was diagnosed at age 4 with autism. And he really should have been diagnosed years earlier. I mean, blind Freddie could see. But I was a first-time mum and I didn't know what I was looking at, and people dropped me gentle hints, but I wasn't ready. I was still in the denial phase. And the cycles of kind of grieving over a diagnosis tend to kind of, and I'm sure anybody who's grieved knows this, you don't sort of go, right, well, I'm done with denial now, so we can move on to this one, and, you know, they come back. So I can still do denial pretty well, and, you know, he's 26 now.
And so you found out that at 4 he had autism. And what were his symptoms at that stage? How was he behaving?
Yeah, he was he was engaged in a great deal of repetitive behaviour. His eye contact was 0. He would throw things, that was his thing. Just anything he'd pick up, he'd throw. He used to flick his fingers in front of his face, which, of course, is a way. Most of these sorts of behaviours in autistic people are a way of processing the world and sort of doing self-care, basically. We know now, but this was years and years and years ago, and it was seen as a dreadful thing that a young person would engage in these repetitive sort of behaviours. And, you know, he would have enormous meltdowns, which it's very difficult. I'm sure a lot of parents who might be listening to this with children on the spectrum will sympathise, because they don't look any different from other children. He was a gorgeous little blonde, curly-haired moppet with these massive eyes who would just drop in the supermarket and flail, and you know, I'd get lots of looks, and people obviously thinking, you know, can't you control your child? That child just needs a snack, I got told on a number of occasions. I remember one memorable time he just plonked down in the middle of the confectionery aisle, just went nuts because I'd told him he couldn't have something. And this older man, probably grandfatherly age, wandered by and glared at me, and I was just fed up. So I turned around and said, if you've got any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. He ran as fast as he could in the opposite direction. But, you know, I was just fed up. But at least at that age, when they're melting down, you could just pick them up, abandon the groceries, pick them up and run to the car and, you know, outing over, which we frequently did. But, yes, he went along to an early childhood intervention preschool. But services were very hard to come by in Sydney, long waiting lists, all that kind of thing. And I didn't really know what I needed for him. You know, if I were transplanted back in time now, knowing what I know now, I'd be an absolute powerhouse. I'd be the bane of every specialist's life with the way I'd badger them and lay down the law. But back then you don't know what you need, and you're super polite and you're afraid to ask. And I didn't know that I needed to be much stronger and firmer and really advocate for my child and, you know, bang my fist on a few tables, metaphorically speaking.
Mm-hmm. And then when did you decided to have a second child?
Yeah, so all our children seemed to be happy accidents. We'd been talking about it, and then Dylan appeared sort of a little over 2 years later, and that was very challenging. And I got postnatal depression. And I'd had postnatal depression with Liam. I just didn't know what the symptoms were like. So when Dylan was about 6 months old, everything was really bad, and I kind of disappeared down the black hole. And was really struggling. Probably I was struggling from the outset, but I didn't really know what I was looking at. It wasn't very widely sort of known about in those days, and I still felt very reluctant to take any medication. I felt like that was an admission of defeat and kind of somehow something shameful to do. It wasn't like it is today with the treatments that are available. And one day I stood in the early childhood clinic waiting for Dylan's appointment and looked at all the symptoms of postnatal depression and realised I had every one. Because a lot of them are quite physical symptoms like breathlessness and dizziness and being unable to eat and feeling like you're choking and sleeplessness and all that stuff, as well as suicidal thoughts. And once I started having those, I was really scared. So I remember one day sitting on the back step, and my husband had taken the children to the park, and I remember sitting there just in the depths of misery. I'd spent the entire day crying, and I just thought, I wonder if I'll have enough time to kill myself before he gets back from the park.
Gosh.
And I thought that I would connect a vacuum hose to the exhaust of the car and shut all the garage windows. And then I remembered that we didn't have any duct tape, so I couldn't do it. So that gave me a bit of a fright. I was not ill enough not to be able to go, hang on, this isn't right. You have to reach out to him and tell him what's going on for you. So when he got back, it takes all your strength, because you push people away when you're depressed. You don't have any energy. You've got no impetus. But I stood at the kitchen sink. I'll never forget it. And I said, you have to help me. I'm in all sorts of trouble. This is what's going on. And he mobilised the troops, took me away on holiday. His mother was amazing to me and told me lots of stories about her own experience. And once you start talking about this, you realise it's the same with what we're going to talk about in a minute with adolescent violence. Once you get talking to women, you realise you're not alone. You're not the only one who's going through this, and that helped me enormously. And then I went back to work a couple of days a week, which gave me the break I needed, and I slowly healed. But I still do have depressive and anxiety symptoms that I manage now in later life, which I've got. Touch wood, I'm doing quite well. So, but yeah, it was something that started off when the kids were little, and I was stuck in isolation. I didn't have a car. We were living in Sydney's inner west. I was cooped up for 12 hours a day with 2 small children in a tiny house, one of whom was severely disabled. It would drive, if I didn't have postnatal depression, I would have ended up with it when I look back on it. It was tough.
Yeah. And then at some stage you had a third child, and also you moved to Tasmania. So talk me through that. Yeah.
So when Liam was 6, we decided that mainstream schooling wasn't the way to go. We were in denial about special schools, because the one we toured seemed quite draconian. And I think when they showed me the padded room with the locked door where students went, when my brain couldn't process. So I thought there's got to be something else. And I thought homeschooling will homeschool. And I found a program based out of the Autism Treatment Centre in Massachusetts called the Sunrise Program, which is it's like a combination of ABA and floor time. So it's a really intensive program that involves one-on-one play therapy with your child in a specially designed, very low stimulus playroom. And like with all treatments for autism, or many of the more successful ones, intensive intervention is the key. And this was a volunteer-based program. So you recruit and train your volunteers to come in and work with your child, and you observe them, and we had like a two-way window in the playroom. So I would train them and give them feedback, and I would work with him myself, and so with my husband's sister. We all were involved. So at the height of it, we had sort of 6 volunteers working with Liam. And when I heard about this program, I thought it could really be a fantastic opportunity. But living in Sydney, we just didn't have enough support to do it. And people in Sydney at that time weren't really very much minded to volunteer, because people were just working so hard they didn't have time. Whereas in Tasmania, people volunteer a lot more. And we thought also, because Adam's parents lived here, they'd retired down here, we'd be able to have a lot more support with the other 2 children, so we could devote ourselves to the program. So we moved down in 2001, and Charlie was born in 2002. But in 2001, it was actually shortly after 9/11, I went over to America and flew to the Autism Treatment Centre and started training there. And then just a couple of years later, we were able to fundraise $20,000 to take Liam with us for a week of intensive. And that's basically where your child is worked with by their facilitators and teachers, and they work with you and train you as well and make sure that you're going well in the playroom. And that was an incredible experience too. And these were in the days before crowdfunding or GoFundMe, so it was really just all the community banded around to get the funds necessary to take him there. So, yeah, we ran the program for about 6 years, and it really kickstarted his language. In a funny twist, we found out later on, when Charlie, our youngest, was 6, that he also had autism. He's on the spectrum and he has ADHD, but he's quite high functioning. He's quite socially awkward, but yeah, he's fairly high functioning. So then I had 2 special needs children.
Wow.
We just thought, we got the diagnosis and we kind of thought, bring it on. You've come to the right house. You've come to the right shop, mate. You'll be fine. We can handle anything.
And so where were you at this stage in terms of...
Well, I was working I worked a couple of days a week for Qantas when I was running the home program, which was really useful because it meant that when we were going back and forth to the States for the treatment, we could access staff travel. So that saved us an awful lot of money in travel costs. And then once Liam was about 12, his eye contact was doing so well. His eye contact was almost normal, and his language was doing quite well too. Although difficult to understand and only 2 or 3 word sentences, he was able to get his meaning across. And he was doing so much better that we sent him along to the special school down here, Southern Support School, which was really amazing. And there were some fantastic teachers there, and he graduated there when he was 18. And then at that stage we'd bought a house. We were both working again, Adam full-time and me part-time. It's very difficult for both parents to work full-time. It's practically impossible when you have a serious or significant disability among your children. You just basically the primary carer burns out. So we found we used to swap roles a lot. So Adam would be the primary carer for a few years, and then he'd burn out and we'd swap, or he'd just go, I just can't do it anymore. And then we'd swap over. So it interrupts your career trajectory quite a bit. It's kind of one of the hidden costs of disability, that the income tends to suffer throughout your lifetime because you can't sort of get any momentum going. And you certainly can't both be working full-time. Someone's just got to accept that, they've got to put their career aspirations to one side because you're always going to have this. So it wasn't until Liam turned 18 and got an NDIS package that I went back to work full-time.
What's Adam's job?
He's a horticulturalist. So, he works in a nursing home at the moment and takes care of the gardens there. But at the time when we lived in Sydney, he worked in the clothing industry for General Pants. He's always worked in logistics sort of up till then. Yeah.
And so Liam went to the local special school. Yeah. And then how were things at home at that stage?
Things deteriorated badly when Liam was about 15, when he hit puberty. I am assuming puberty is one of the causes, but as it transpired neurologically, there was pretty much plenty going on for him too. So, I suppose he'd always been pretty strong and reasonably tall. He's about 5'10" now, which is not that tall, but he was quite tall as an adolescent. Everyone's taller than me. I'm only 5 foot nothing. But he was very soon stronger than me and very determined, and when heightened, very strong. So once he hit about 15, things got really dangerous, and we saw an escalation in behaviour that led to a lot of aggression, scratching, biting, kicking, throwing objects. He threw a kitchen knife at his brother one time, like a steak knife. He threw a drink bottle in my face, great big black eye. It was the week I started a new job in a 5-star hotel. It was great. Put the makeup on. Like every day at work, I had to go back and leave because you just rip your arms to shreds when you didn't want to get on the school bus in the morning. So pretty much every day was a huge challenge, but it was so unpredictable. The violence, you just couldn't see it coming. Like he'd throw something at you, but you had no warning. You had no kind of sign that he was getting heightened. So no one could sit with their backs to the door for about 3 years. He would just throw objects into the dinner table. So we had to have like melamine plates and cutlery and that kind of thing. But we were all terrified. We were living on our nerves. Every time you heard a noise, you'd just jump. So lots of breakages. He'd put his fist through windows and then he wouldn't let me treat it. So he'd get all lacerated and I'd sort of try to get him to let me have a go at it because there was no question we'd take this child to hospital. We were in a lockdown mode. He'd get off the school bus, he'd come into the house, we'd deadlock everything. There were bolts on all the gates because he was a bolter as well. He would run across 4 lanes of traffic. He'd just run. So it was really, really, really hairy. And the younger two were aged 13 and 8. And Dylan was just starting high school, my middle boy, and it was so hard because pretty much they spent a lot of that time locked in their rooms. I just used to have to say, run to your bedroom and lock the door.
Poor kids.
Yeah, and they couldn't have nice things because he'd wreck them. They couldn't have their friends around. There was no question of that. So they really struggled to form friendships. I mean, who can understand a home situation like that? And, even if he wasn't being violent, he'd do things like inappropriate things like go to the bathroom and take his entire bottom half off and just come wandering back into the living room with his pants in his hand. Now, if your 15-year-old girlfriend's around, she doesn't want to see your 18-year-old brother his ear off. So it's really awkward. So, yeah, he would go on rampages sometimes and just break everything. And at one stage I remember I just took the younger two and ran to the back shed and just locked us in for about half an hour, I guess, and then I could hear the noises that stopped and I came back in and there was just broken glass everywhere and his hand was bleeding and, just spent the afternoon sweeping up broken glass. And at the time he was sleeping a few hours a night, not very much. The autism meant that he didn't sleep great, and probably the seizures he was having. He had lots of seizure activity going on in his brain even when he wasn't having actual epileptic seizures. He was on multiple anticonvulsants, but tuberous sclerosis, intractable epilepsy is a feature. So it can change markedly over their lives, so you've got to rethink your strategy. Plus it can be very difficult to treat. So you don't, if you get good seizure control, fantastic, but we had never have really. So he wasn't sleeping much at night. He was incontinent at night, so he would wet the bed sometimes twice a night. So washing sheets was just like constant thing. And he'd just be up. And so we used to take it in turns to sleeping on the couch because someone had to make sure that he didn't hurt himself or, terrorise his brothers or leave the fridge door open, all that kind of stuff. So we were really sleep deprived. We were only getting about 2 nights a fortnight of respite. And half the time they'd ring us and say, come and get him. He's hurt another client, or we can't, it's too dangerous, that kind of stuff. So we never could go out of town. And it's taken me years to get over dreading my mobile phone ringing, because I used to think, oh, God, what is it now? They're going to ring us. Oh, my God. And, you'd pick him up at school and you'd get the litany of, well, he bit him and he threw that, it was really demoralising, and we were exhausted.
And this was a special needs school?
Yeah. They did a great job, though. I mean, I know they tried not to sort of make me feel bad. But his teacher in his final 2 years was just an amazing woman. She said to me, look, everything will change when he gets to 18. Trust me. We've just got to get in there. She was amazing, Penny. So I had some in-home support, but those workers got withdrawn because Liam's behaviour was so dangerous. And in any case, they weren't allowed to intervene when he was attacking me because they would get hurt. So that wasn't helpful either. And I never thought to call the police, because what were they going to do? Put him in a cell? How's that going to help a highly agitated, severely intellectually disabled young man? It's not going to help us. So I never sort of went there. But we did admit when he was 16 that we could no longer care for him. And so we went to our local area coordinator and said, we need a group home for him urgently. Our younger two are at risk. This is not going to work. And we were on the wait list until he was 18. And every time we'd meet and every time I went along with my advocate, they'd say, you're near the top of the list. There's still nothing. One day, a worker at the respite centre said to me, Selina, the only way is for you to just drop him off at respite and don't come back. Just abandon him in care. It's the only way. I hate to tell you this, but it is the only way. But we never could bring ourselves to do it. And I'm glad we didn't because we healed and,
well, tell me, just go back to when he was 15. So you said you had some in-house workers and that wasn't a huge amount of help. What other support mechanisms did you have, and how were you living that at that stage?
Goodness knows. I was very depressed and suicidal again. I used to think, I'd have the kids in the back of the car and I'd think, I'll just drive into that telegraph pole and it'll all be over quickly and the kids will be okay because they're in the back. It felt like that. But you don't have time to think much about yourself. You do know you're extremely stressed and you're living on like a thread of sleep and a lot of caffeine. But I had some wonderful co-workers at the time. I was working part-time in a small hotel, and I didn't tell anyone, but after the first year they could see what was going on. And so I told them, and my boss was just wonderful. He used to say, show me your arms, and I'd hold out my arms with all the scratches and bruises, and he'd go, yeah, I've seen worse. How about I make you a lovely coffee? Oh, I love you. So it was actually really nice. It was kind of my respite, which was great. But yeah, we had the usual raft of specialists, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, psychologists, behaviour specialists. But honestly, half the time, and it took a while to dawn on me, half the time I was sitting in meetings with them, I was realising that they didn't know what to do either. They would give me articles to read. They'd say, here's a magazine article that might help you. How do I have time to read that? Oh, here's some board maker symbols and some social stories. Here's the link. You print them out and laminate them and, Velcro them to your son's backpack. Oh, seriously? I have 2 other children and I work and I'm tired and I'm stressed out of my mind. But, of course, they weren't funded to do any more than really do that for me. And a lot of the time when we'd sit in meetings and they'd say, so what do you do when he does blah-de-blah? I used to think, oh, this is nice. They're asking me as a parent. They want my opinion. It dawned on me later that probably they didn't know what to do. They were asking me because they didn't know. And I was depressed then because I thought, well, surely I'm not the only child with complex needs in Tasmania. But, maybe it is rarer than now. I work in the disability sector and I see that it's not. But then people are much more willing to come forward now since the NDIS because they know they can get help. Whereas I think there was a lot of suffering in silence back in my day. And people don't talk a lot about family violence, which we'll probably get to for all sorts of reasons. So,
And now with hindsight, when Liam was 15, what would have been an ideal situation for you? I mean, what would have been good strategies? What would have been a good way for him to be cared for? What would have been an ideal support system?
Yeah. Really, even though he was very young, I do think probably living away from the family home in a home of his own, fully supported, would have been much better. Because as we found out when that happened when he was 18, he did way better under the care of a dedicated team of regulars who knew him intimately, well, they got to know him, and who could devote their time on shift just to him, who were available, who were ready to help him, and who got to go home at the end of their 8-hour shift and recharge their batteries. A team of people with varied interests, genders, ages, fitness, passions, would really grow him, and that's what ended up happening. But I wasn't ready to let go of him. He was my boy and I loved him, but it would have been the making of him. Alternatively, much bigger chunks of respite and much better training in the respite staff, and perhaps some kind of way of matching him up with other clients where he wasn't going to sort of spark off huge disasters every time he went. But that's not always practical. I do understand that. But, yeah, more time away from him would have made all the difference.
And so now, so when he was 18, he went, and what happened then?
He was in the first tranche of young people in Australia to be offered an NDIS portfolio. So he was invited to participate and given a large funding portfolio because it was the first tranche. They basically told us to take our pick of services, more or less. It was kind of a very fortunate position to be in because they were basically going, have this, and have some more of this and that. So his entire supported living program was funded and his day programs were funded. And he lived in a private rental with a flatmate for about 18 months. But that didn't really work out. The 2 boys, there was personality conflict. And, in fact, then he became a victim of domestic violence because the other young man was quite violent. His family background, there was violence there, which was very sad. So we found out about, through Liam's coordinator, about an intentional community down south in Tasmania, which was set up by the Uniting Church down there, who got a federal government grant to build villas on the church land to create an inclusive community for people with disability where they'd be able to come and go in these brand new purpose-built villas and still have activities within the church community, activities like their chook shed and their veggie garden, barbecues, zumba, drumming workshops, all kinds of things, social things to do with each other. And he got a 2-bedroom unit and is cared for there with the carers taking the second bedroom overnight and they sleep when they do overnight shifts. And he's doing really, really well there. His NDIS portfolio is ongoing and certainly has been really fantastic. Also, when he was 18, he had neurosurgery. We were finally able to establish a case for one of the tubers in his brain being the culprit at sparking off quite a lot of his seizure activity. So he had a tuber about the size of a plum resected from his frontal lobe. And straight away post-operatively, once we got over the initial few days of high drama due to, him not wanting to keep his dressing on and not wanting to tear all the cannulas out and all that kind of hoo-ha. His personality changed. He really, really changed behaviourally. So we were able to wean him off a lot of the behaviour drugs he was on. And he just became really tractable and easy to cope with, and very gentle and sweet. He still fires up occasionally, but he tends to throw things and not hurt people. Like he'll still throw a few books across the room if he's annoyed, but, I wish I could throw books across the room. Worse things happen at sea. It's not only paperbacks. Hell, I don't care. Yeah. But, so that changed everything for him because that tuber was sparking off seizures activity every 2 minutes or so. So a lot of the unpredictable behaviour became really clear there. And plus, as children age, their prefrontal cortex develops. And in boys, that's often not until the age of 25, and that's the area responsible for impulse control and good decision-making and, just general sort of sensible adult behaviour. So the older he gets, the easier it does get with him. He's very sweet and gentle. Most importantly, I think his relationship with his brothers healed because they had the chance to miss him, and they're pretty close now. The youngest still is a bit because he has sensory issues around the various noises that Liam makes. And also he was with Liam when he was small, so he was always frightened of him, whereas my middle boy, they were very close, he and Liam, growing up. And Dylan's a very compassionate soul, and they're very sweet together. We did manage to heal, and I think with the right resources and enough support, families can heal. Families can be incredibly resilient. It's just that in many cases, especially where there's challenging behaviour, they just don't get the support they need, and the child or young person ends up in horrible situations like, psychiatrics for people with intellectual disability and complex behaviours.
Can you remember some of the good times when the children were smaller?
Oh, yeah. And I remember a lot of the good times during the horror years too. I mean, they weren't unrelentingly horrible. They were very stressful and very scary sometimes, but funny things still happened and we still had fun. We still tried to do things together, although Liam often tanked any outing. But if we sort of were out in the middle of nowhere or, kind of on a beach or whatever, we could still have a happy day. We were still capable of caring about each other. But, yeah, I do remember a lot of the funny things that at the time are extremely stressful, but they become funny later, like the time Anglicare bought him a big 3-wheeler bike, bought Liam one of those big grown-up size trike things, and we used to take it to the local bike track, and one of us would go along behind with the younger two on their bikes while Liam sort of pedalled his big 3-wheeler along the bike track, and the other one would jog alongside the 3-wheeler to make sure he didn't get away from us. And so one time we were down the bike track and I said to my husband, whose turn is it? And he said, oh, I don't know, I don't mind. I said, well, look, I've got a fun run next week. I'm training for that. Why don't I do it? Okay, fine. And we always had his bike set on a really low gear, so he really had to work hard and go really slow. So he'd get a great workout and he wouldn't get away from you. Unbeknownst to me, as Adam had got the bike off the back of the ute, he'd knocked the bike into like the high gear, the one where it's really easy to pedal, and Liam just shot off like he'd been shot from a cannon. And I just went pelting after him. Adam's behind with we only had Charlie that day, who was only little, and our dog Meg, the Jack Russell, and he's got them. So I've gone pelting off and I'm jogging along and thinking he's getting away from me. I'm not going to catch him. There's just no way known. And, of course, at the end of the bike track, there was a service station and then a set of shops. And we always used to get a fizzy drink at the shops. So Liam knew that would be his treat. So it dawned on me that he was actually heading for the shop. But in doing so, he'd have to come off the bike track, navigate a busy service station and get into the car park of this little set of 3 shops or whatever. So I was just freaking out. I'm thinking I'm not going to catch him. There's no way I'm going to catch him. Next thing, I'm running, and my husband shoots past me on a bike. We didn't bring a bike for Adam. There was no bike. And he didn't have the dog. And it turns out what had happened was he'd seen what was going to happen, recognised I wasn't going to catch him, seen 2 men standing by the side of the bike track with their bikes chatting, and said to one of them, "Excuse me, mate, my autistic child headed for the road. Can I borrow your bike?" "Thanks." "Oh, hold my dog." So this guy's lost a bike and he's going for a small white dog and he's gone, what? Liam shot off after Liam on the bike and only succeeded in basically watching him pull in safely into the car park his bike, walk into the shop and get his drink out of the fridge. Adam arrived just in time to pay for the drink. So, yeah, that was an interesting day. So, of course, I'm kind of trying to be a good parent going, that's very bad, Liam. You mustn't do that. That's not the way to get fizzy drink. He's holding the drink thinking, well, I've got the fizzy drink, so it's a pretty good way to me. No problem. Oh, because you're thinking, what do we do? You're looking at each other going, what's responsible parenting here? We're not encouraging this, but he's safe. That's great. What do we do?
Yeah, so maybe he managed it himself.
He did, yeah. And it's so much of special needs parenting. He's just kind of looking at each other going, the hell do we do about this? Yeah. I mean, there are lots of books now, but like with complex challenging behaviour, oftentimes you're just sort of scratching your head going, now what the hell do we do here? And you don't, with violent behaviour, you don't get a lot of warning. It just is happening and suddenly you're deep in it and you've got to do something and you don't know what to do. So, you know, a lot of times violence can be a cycle that happens because you will lash out. You will be tired and stressed and frightened and you'll just be over it all and you'll shout and you might push your child or you might smack your child. I mean, I did all of those things. I'm not proud of it at all. But I was pressed beyond what I could, like unbelievable levels of stress, and I was scared, partly defending myself, but partly I'll admit I just lashed out. It's like a reflex, and it just begets violence. It makes everything so much worse. And then you feel terrible. Your child feels terrible. Your child, you know, Liam knew right from wrong. So when the moment had passed, he'd sort of go, sorry, mummy, sorry, and all this. And I'd be like, no, I'm sorry, I'm a terrible mother. Bring my sister in tears, the whole deal. Because, of course, you can't teach a child not to hit if you're hitting the child. And we knew this too, but you get stuck in this cycle of desperation. And this obviously is how you see violence perpetuate in families.
And I think that it doesn't just apply to special needs families. I think, I think most parents have probably been there.
Oh, yeah. You get pushed beyond what you can reasonably expect with all parenting. And with the younger children, they'd just be like, you know, why can't you fix it? He gets different treatment to us. It's not fair, all this. And, you know, or he'd take something and they'd sort of want to belt him and I'd be going, no, I'm trying to get in the middle of it all and stuff. Now, children without disabilities belt each other all the time.
Yes.
So, sometimes I look back on it and I think, I can remember my sister and I just used to full on, fist fight each other on the couch or whatever. And, I've talked to boys, like friends who have brothers, and they're like, oh, yeah, they used to belt me up all the time. But, of course, when your child has a disability, you think, oh, no, that's not right. You can't hit him and that's not the way to teach behaviour and stuff like that. But, it's quite funny the way we sort of look at, our children without disabilities and kind of go, yeah, okay, no problem. Just let me know if there's blood and I'll come then. But no, somehow it's different. So, we've all got to tippy-toe around Liam. And really it would have made things much worse because cognitively he wouldn't have been able to understand what the difference between rough housing and, But it's difficult to defuse anger in a younger child when they're feeling hardly done by. And they have a right to feel hardly done by. Their childhood was rough. I did the best I could, but often I could not even keep my own self safe. So,
how are they doing now, the younger children?
Yeah, they struggled and meant to be treated for it. So we keep a close eye on them. They're doing well now. Neither of them are medicated these days. The youngest still sees a psychologist regularly, but he had a very tough high school, being bullied and ostracised and mocked for being different and that type of thing. But he's just finished year 12 and his final couple of years of school have been much happier and he's got a friendship network going and he's looking for a full-time job and he's busy with all his different artistic pursuits and creative pursuits. The middle boy's very happy. He's been living out of home since he was 18. He couldn't wait to get out. So that was fine. He works full-time. He's got a great friendship network and, So, yeah, they're doing well, but it was a long process. It was very hard, very stressful, very traumatic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how are you doing now?
Yeah, life is good. It's been certainly a roller coaster ride, but I would not wish any of it away. It's been an incredible growth journey, and I'm grateful for the person that I am today and the strength and resilience and patience I've acquired and the ability to kind of really stress less about lots of stuff. You get a massive perspective check, which is good. And I've had the opportunity to meet some absolutely incredible people. Everybody involved with Liam's care has been amazing, but also obviously his volunteers, many of whom are still really dear friends, who were just wonderful people who gave up their time to work with our boy and became dear family friends. I now work in the disability sector, so that's really fun, and I feel like it's kind of, for years I've advocated and written and blogged and spoken at public events and on forums off the side of my desk while I was working in hospitality and tourism and travel. But now I've managed to turn my side gig into my main gig. I'm doing postgrad study. My marriage broke up in 2019, but I'm very happy and settled. I'm really happy on my own, and I've got wonderful friends, and yeah, I consider myself to be very lucky. And I'm doing a job that I adore and where I feel I can really help people, which is what I always wanted to do.
So what are you actually doing in the disability sector?
Yeah, so I'm a peer network connector. So I basically, part of the time, so part of my job is basically helping people. So people who phone us, people who come to see us, who need help with a range of issues. Common ones include NDIS, financial challenges, schools, access to education is a real problem here. We get a lot of children who are refused educational access because of complex behaviours. We get a lot of people who are suffering under family violence, either through adolescents, of whom we're seeing younger and younger young people. There was a 5-year-old the other day that stabbed his mother with a kitchen knife.
Oh, my goodness.
Which was quite alarming. And trying to support those people. And because the people at my work are mostly parents of children with disability ourselves, we're really able to reach out and kind of build a great rapport with people who are just desperate and don't know what else to do. And we can then kind of help them out with sort of, some services that might help them and ideas and strategies that they can then kind of adopt and support them through times like that. I facilitate a weekly group of homeschooling mums who homeschool their children with disabilities. So every Friday we get together during the school term, and they're an amazing bunch. And I feel a lot of in common with them because I homeschooled for years. So that's really great. I love doing that. And the rest of the time I write web content for our website, Finding Your Way, which is a very hands-on kind of practical guide to everything from justice, health, employment, family, sport, access to all the kinds of things that people need, with all the information in sort of one easy place, easy to understand. And we have a voice activation and an easy English version too. So it's been a really good learning curve, learning to do that. I do a lot of things like reading NDIS papers and trying to decipher them and make them into plain English. So that's fun. But no, it's really, I feel like I'm making a difference, helping a lot. And I still do quite a lot of work in the adolescent violence space, advocating, mentoring. So I mentor quite a number of people, a couple on the mainland, and I make myself available for people locally who are just wanting someone to talk to who's been through it. Not necessarily even to offer any solutions, just to understand, just someone at the other end of the phone type thing. I always swore when we were going through the worst of it that I would want to help me, like future me wanted to help then me. I thought, I can't be the only one. I felt like the only one. Turns out I wasn't. But I thought I really want to, when I have time on my hands and my kids are older and I can do this, to help. So in 2017, the organisation that I work for now, who at the time were our advocates, asked me to go public with the story of adolescent family violence in our family, because it's something that's often not shared through reasons of shame. Airing the train wreck of your life in front of people is really scary. and people's reactions can be really kind of completely horrified, and you feel even more isolated when you get that reaction. But also people worry that they'll have their other children taken away from them if they report what's going on. And, of course, they worry about, child protection coming and, taking their other children away, or taking their aggressive, challenging child away. They don't want that either, so they just sort of suffer. And also with disability, with profound disability, you can't walk away from the child. You can't go into the other room. The child's not safe to be left on their own. So, there's kind of no escape, really. So I did agree, and we did a whole magazine on adolescent violence. And we approached it from a whole range of perspectives. At the time, I was doing some work with RMIT on their PIPA project. Elena Campbell was doing a research piece on PIPA stands for Positive Interventions for Perpetrators of Adolescent Violence. And basically it's a way to try and develop systems that keep young people who are violent in the home out of the criminal justice system. And when they did the research, Australia-wide, they found a huge percentage of young adolescents who are violent have disabilities. Like it was 30%, something like that. I'm making it up. I can't remember. But a high percentage. So that adds to the complexities of the situation. And if there's one place you really don't want your child to be, it's in the criminal justice system. But if there's one place you especially don't want your severely intellectually child with an intellectual disability to be, it's in the criminal justice system. It's just not tenable. I mean, you and I can't understand the kind of legalese that goes on most times, let alone, your child who is just in no way equipped. And you don't want them going through that pathway that leads to remand or prison or, those sort of criminal justice outcomes. Nobody does. So I did a bit of work with them and sat on a couple of panels with sort of family court judges and police officers and that type of stuff. Had a great chance to talk quite a lot with the police, who really do a fantastic job, but they are not trained disability workers, and they're often called into situations like this with minimal training. So I then did a bit of work with the University of Tasmania on course content for police officers, which I did with one of their law lecturers there in the Faculty of Law. So that was fascinating. So I'd been doing that work, and then when the magazine article came out, I was warned that I might cop quite a lot of flack because it's very difficult. Many in the disability sector feel that it's not really a good idea to put portrayals of people with disability out there that are really negative, that we need positive success stories, and, we need to sort of emphasise the positive when it comes to disability. And I totally agree. And I would say I'm all for that, but for the fact that there are family who are getting hurt here. There are family, and there are especially other siblings who didn't ask for this, who are getting hurt. So when I call a young person who is sort of doing adolescent violence in the home a perpetrator, I'm sorry if you don't like that word, but that is what they will be called. And unless we can start to name these things up, we are never going to get help for these women, hundreds of them, who are cowering in their kitchens. I spoke to Rosie Batty, the wonderful domestic violence advocate here in Australia, at a breakfast. I bought her book and went up and had it signed. And I spoke to her a little bit about violence from adolescents. And I said, have you heard about it? And told her about my work. And she said, every single time I speak, at least one woman comes up and tells me about it. It's happening. It's out there. And it's not the purpose, or one of the big pluses of having someone like me come out and speak is to show that it's not just happening in households, that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, because there's a really popular misconception, and I probably shared it, that only happens to families who are struggling, the families who really can't cope, who are, who, I don't know, have all sorts of drug problems or abuse problems or mental health issues or are socioeconomically disadvantaged. No, it happens everywhere. It happened to me. It happens to all kinds of people. No one is immune, and it could just happen. It could just happen out of the blue. You don't know, and you don't know what other people are going through.
What's the extent of the problem? Do you have any sort of feeling of how many households this is happening in?
Well, because it's underreported for the reasons I've mentioned, it's a bit difficult to say, but I have seen some statistics that put it at around, I think they were saying in a 4-year period, and I forget which years it was, but it was back in sort of, I think, 2012 to 2016. I think there were hundreds of cases that were reported to Victorian police.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but common, very common. I mean, if you take the disability part of it, probably less common. But adolescent violence as a whole, as I'm sure we're all aware, encompasses things like drugs can be a factor, alcohol can be a factor, all sorts of things can be a factor. So, yeah, that's really quite widespread. I think it's about 17% of family violence cases. So it's nowhere near as severe as partner violence, and the deaths are a lot lower. Adolescents don't kill people as often, although they do sometimes. But, yeah, there's certainly a big chunk of suffering out there. And, you know, I would never try to sort of compare or try to prioritise adolescent violence against partner violence, because we all know the shocking statistics. And here in Australia, I think one woman dies every week at the hands of her partner, some horrendous statistic like that. But it is still a problem, and I think if there is violence, we need to address it. I don't think we need to be quantifying necessarily. It's not helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. I mean, I've interviewed somebody who works with women in domestic violence, and she was saying that the statistics she told me were absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, she said that 1/3 of women in the world are subject to domestic violence, 1/3. And in Western Europe, it's 1/4. And so 1/4 is considered to be fairly low. I mean, that is just...
So it's unacceptable, isn't it? And it is largely women. And the same with adolescent violence. It's largely women, you know, especially with young men. They behave, in my experience anyway, very differently towards their mothers than they do to their fathers. But it fractures families because fathers feel they have to stand up for their female partners, and they will put themselves, they will, you know, the aggression heightens when you get that testosterone in the mix, I think. And I think it's very difficult for a man to watch his partner being hit by their child. It's very confronting. It speaks to all sorts of issues about a man's ability to protect his family. I mean, maybe that's an archaic way of viewing gender roles, but it does come into play. I'm 54, you know, in my generation, that sort of thing does come into play, and it plunged my husband into the deepest of depressions that he couldn't keep me safe. And it created a really, really almost Oedipal relationship with him and Liam. They just sparked off each other, and it took a long time for that relationship to heal. It did heal. They're really close. He loves his daddy, loves him, and Adam loves him as well. But, yeah, there was a lot of kind of, I'm mummy's boy, and, you know, you can't have mummy, and if daddy walked into the room, there'd be huge fuss and all this sort of stuff. And half the time, just to keep the peace, I'd sort of say, look, just go. Just do what he wants, because I just can't cope anymore. I'm too tired. Which, of course, I thought, this is terrible. I can't be sitting in here on the end of his bed until he goes to sleep. He's 16, for God's sake. But I just can't have him out there rampaging the house either. So, yeah. So lots of things go by the board in terms of the way you'd like to raise them and the standards and the limits and boundaries you'd like to set. Half the time you just give up and go, you know what? Eat all 6 icy bowls. I can't go. Are there any gin and tonic flavoured ones in there? You can see how my sense of humour's kept me going. And that's, in a way, why I started the blog, because I started to write funny stories, because all my friends said to me, oh, my God, some of your stories are hilarious, like the bike story I told you. They said, oh, you have to write them down. They're so funny. They make us all laugh. I started writing them down, and, yeah, it went from there, and funny stories became things.
Selina, there's I usually ask 2 questions at the end of these interviews. I mean, one is what has been your experience of life as a woman? But I think you've probably already answered that very, very largely, unless you've got something to add to that.
No, I think I've said it all.
And the other question I ask is if there's a message that you've got for people who are listening.
Yes, I certainly feel that given the statistics we've discussed, there are bound to be women out there who are frightened or who are cowed, coerced, worried, threatened by their children. You're not alone. You really aren't. Isolation and the feeling that you can't talk to another human being about this, that this is just happening to you, and, you know, this is the most dreadful thing, that you can't talk to anybody about it because no one will understand, is wrong. There are heaps of people out there just like you. So talk about it. I know it's hard. It's awful. You don't want to tell anybody, you know, especially as a professional woman. I felt, who would employ me in any serious professional capacity if they knew what a train wreck my home life was? Talk to them. Tell them anyway. You'd be amazed. I sat at a table at a breakfast fundraiser for a women's shelter, and at the table was a woman in her 60s probably, impeccably dressed, lovely red pantsuit, gorgeous jewellery, beautifully presented. She sits on several boards. She's quite a prominent local woman. And she told me that for years her husband of 30 years had violently abused her, and it culminated in him breaking her arm. She said, I've never told another person because I was ashamed. Talk to people, reach out to your networks, even if it's just your hairdresser, tell someone, get the ball rolling, and be comforted that there are others out there like you, and that increasingly the word is getting out about this now, and you do not have to suffer.
Well, thanks for that, Selina. And that's a very, very potent message, I think. And it talks a lot, I think, to people's shame. I think that so often in situations of domestic violence, there's shame and there's people feeling, I must be doing something wrong. If they're treating me like that, I must be doing something wrong. But sometimes, no, it's just not your fault. So I think that's a very, very powerful message. And I am just blown over with how well you've come through this, just your resilience, your humour, your also the way that you reach out to other people, that you've got your own support networks, you're providing support networks for other people, and that there's a real sense that you're part of a strong community of people, you know, with children with disabilities and with special needs. So, I mean, my heart goes out to you with all that you've been through, and also my admiration.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
You so much.
So thank you for your time. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.